Hey guys, Jeff Dobson with J. Richard Photography. Today I'm going to talk to you about the most important part of photography and what you have to learn to become a better photographer, and that is the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is made up of three things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We're going to talk about all three and how they can affect the photograph and how it turns out. So let's begin with aperture. Aperture, the most simple way I can think to explain it is to imagine like the pupil of your eye. The more open your pupil is, the more light that comes in. The lens has the same way. There's basically a hole in your lens that the wider it is, the more light it lets in, and the smaller it is, the less light it lets in. And there's blades inside your lens that open and close based on the aperture. Now, it can get a little confusing. Aperture is shown with a number beside the letter F, also known as like f-stop, you'll hear it called. Now, the confusing part, the bigger the hole, the bigger the opening in the lens, the smaller the F number, and the brighter the image is going to be. And the bigger the F number, the smaller the hole, and the darker the image is going to be. Make that make sense. But anyway, that's how your aperture works. Some benefits to that lower F number. Obviously, in darker rooms, it's going to let in more light so that you can still hand hold your camera without having to put it on a tripod and get the frame. And also in portrait photography, that's how you get that beautiful blurry background, or what we call bokeh. That's what you get at wide open, as we call it, F numbers, so the real low F numbers. And so on a kit lens, you could expect that to be somewhere around like F4, maybe F5.6. And you could do a simple upgrade if you want to begin to get those blurry backgrounds by grabbing something even like the nifty 50. That's a 50 millimeter f1.8 lens that, you know, for $100, you know, you can immediately be able to shoot more wide open and get those blurry backgrounds. You know, a downside to a lower aperture number is you have less room. You know, the plane of focus is much more narrow. So, you know, if you're slightly off a little bit on your focus, things are going to be very blurry or out of focus. Whereas, you know, as you stop down and that hole gets smaller, you know, more things in the picture become in focus. But to make this hopefully make a little bit more sense is I'm going to show you a series of photographs taken at different f-stops. We're going to start at f2.8 and then go all the way up to f22. And what I want you to pay attention to is the background of the photograph, so you can see how much more the lamps and the pictures in the background get in focus the more stopped down it is. And that's exactly how aperture works. So next, after aperture, we want to think about shutter speed. Shutter speed is how quickly the shutter opens and closes on your camera when you hit that button. Typically, you know, you're going to see that on your camera in whole seconds to fractions of a second. Of course, with fractions of a second being very fast and whole seconds being very slow. Now, the benefit to a slower shutter speed is more light gets introduced to the sensor. It's open longer. The shutter is open longer to let more light come in. Versus a fast shutter speed, it's very quick. So obviously, with a really bright scene, you might need a fast shutter speed so that, you know, not too much light gets to the sensor and it be too bright. Now, the advantage to a faster shutter speed is that with less light coming in, it's stopping motion quicker. So, you know, people moving, it'll freeze them in place. You could even stop a hummingbird in midair. As a wedding photographer, you know, we like to freeze the moments on the dance floor or get the bride coming down the aisle perfectly in focus. Whereas a real dark scene would require that shutter speed to be open longer so that more light can get into the scene so that the scene's not too dark. The downside to slower shutter speed though is it can get to the point where you cannot hand hold it without, you know, just the micro movements of your hand showing up in the photograph. It can be cool though for showing motion in a picture, you know, like a car panning by and the wheels spinning, you know, things like that can be very cool. And you can even go slow enough to where you can see the stars in the sky, stars that you can't see with your eyes. So you have to determine based off what you're looking to accomplish in your photograph, what shutter speed you need to set. And now for the third part of the exposure triangle, ISO. ISO is just how sensitive the sensor of your camera is to light. And unlike f-stop numbers for aperture, it makes total sense. The lower the number, the less sensitive to light. The higher number, the more sensitive to light. Now there is a trade-off. The benefit of increasing your ISO, again in a dark scene, allows you to still handhold your camera at a shutter speed that you can manage without having to put your camera on a tripod and still properly expose the picture. The downside of that is the higher that number gets, the more digital noise gets introduced into the camera. And so you just have to kind of determine how comfortable you are with the amount of noise that's in your photograph and then adjust your ISO accordingly. Higher end cameras like the Canon R6 that I use, I can comfortably go to 6400 ISO and sometimes even a little bit higher and still get images that I think are very usable. But to properly explain and show how ISO works, I'm again going to take photographs right here in the office. And I have set my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second. And I have set the f-stop number to f2.8. And in each photograph, all I'm going to do is dial up the ISO. So you'll see starting at 100th with a 100 ISO, the picture is too dark. But as each step along the way, as I continue to increase ISO all the way up to the max, you'll see just how much brighter the photograph gets, but also how much more digital noise is introduced into the photograph. So to recap ISO, again, the lower the number, the less noise, the less sensitive to light. Less light will be let onto the sensor. The higher the number, the more light, more sensitive to light the sensor will be, the brighter your photograph will be. The benefit of the higher ISO is in dark scenes, we can still handhold our camera, but you got the trade-off of digital noise, where a low ISO lets less light in, so you'd have to possibly use a slower shutter speed, maybe even put your camera on a tripod, but you get no digital noise or less digital noise in that situation. All right, so I know that's a ton of information. That seems like a lot of different things to be thinking about all at one time. Completely get it. But to help hopefully simplify it, just remember that this thing is in a triangle. The exposure is a triangle because each part of it does affect the other. So I've got my aperture dialed in for the look and the depth of field that I want. Next is the shutter speed. So with shutter speed, it's going to be determined by the environment. How bright, is it bright sunny outside, or am I inside and it's dark and all we have is the lights from the DJ going? And then so I'm thinking about, A, how comfortable am I hand holding the camera without getting any blur? And then do I want to be stopping action or allowing that motion blur in like we talked about earlier? Normally for me, I'm wanting to stop action based off what I'm doing. So I am going to try to keep it, you know, at a 1/200, you know, somewhere in that range for me. So then the last thing I like to dial in is my ISO. So I know I'm going to be at f2.8 and 1/200th of a second. So now what does the ISO need to be to properly expose that photograph? Okay. So outside that could be ISO 100. Once we get inside, it could be 2000, 6400. And again, you know, you have to make the determination on, you know, if you take the frame at 6400 and you look and it's just too much noise, you know, maybe you dial the ISO back and then slow your shutter speed down just a little bit, you know, so that those things balance out. Do those things in that order, and then you'll be able to start creating the images that you were envisioning. And then you'll know when you take the photograph, all right, that picture was too dark. What can I do to make it brighter? Do I want to slow down my shutter speed, increase my ISO, open up the aperture? Those are the things you can adjust to properly expose your photograph. So that is the exposure triangle and how you can use it to create images that are nailed in exposure and help you to create the images that you have always been wanting to create. Leave a comment below. I'd love to know, how do you properly expose your photographs? What is your thought process? And what do you do settings-wise to get your exposures exactly like you want them? On the way down, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. I'd love for you to subscribe for more videos like this and behind-the-scenes videos from some of my work. I'm Jeff Dobson with J. Richard Photography, and I'll see you in the next one.